All right, Saturday, 2 o'clock. May Day. Happy May Day, everyone. Welcome back, everyone, to the Midwest Mountaineering Outdoor Adventure Expo. With me virtually, I have the man, the myth, the legend, Bob O'Hara. He's going to be presenting on paddling the Boundary Waters, 60 years of canoe travel. Excuse me. Bob's a member of the Explorers Club of New York and Midwest Mountaineering's Minnesota Explorers Hall of Fame. Long-time canoeist. Really looking forward to this presentation. We're gonna have kind of I would say, rather informal presentation. We do have a slideshow, but if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat box at the outdooradventureexpo.com site, and I will relay those to Bob, and we'll get those answered either during the presentation or it's likely we'll definitely have plenty of time at the end too as well. So don't be shy. Lots of great info coming up here. So without further ado, here is Bob.
Hey, thanks, Adam. Thanks if anybody who happens to be watching. I feel very happy because I'm sitting down. I've been at a track meet all day starting. I just got home about a little over half an hour ago. So I've been in the Boundary Waters 63 years, coming this June when I have my permit. And it's going to be an interesting year in the Boundary Waters because of the pandemic. People discovered it last year and they had one of the highest numbers of people ever. And there's two things you need to know. One is you should get a reservation, which you can get online, and then it has to be converted to a permit. And last year you couldn't get a permit because they were closed, and so you just use your reservation. You cannot do that this year. You have to take your reservation and convert it to a permit. So the Boundary Waters is a great place, and it needs to be protected and it needs to be preserved. And that happened when the Wilderness Act came in '64, and before that, there was a threat of roads and mining and everything else. And today we still have the threat of mining that's not in the Boundary Waters, but it could drain into the Boundary Waters. And that's quite a fight that's ongoing. So my first trip is in '59. Look at this. Look at the clothing. You know, it's all cotton clothing. None of the new fabrics have been made. We got stuff from an outfitter. I can guarantee you, if you want to drink hot drinks in a metal cup, you'll burn your lips. And if you want to put hot food on a metal plate, it gets cold very fast. So the Boundary Waters has been inhabited for a long time. It's not a new phenomenon. And Native Americans live there forever and ever and ever. And there's all kinds of evidence of where they've lived. And they were actively living in the Boundary Waters well into the 1920s and 30s. And one of the things we can find from the Native people is their pictographs, and they're scattered through the Boundary Waters and well into Canada, well into Manitoba and Ontario. And you can easily find sources or books on where pictographs are located. They're made out of iron oxide, which is the dirt, and is combined with some kind of an oil. We think of fish oil, and then it's painted on the rock. So the first white guys to do much in the Boundary Waters were the Voyagers, and the Voyagers, most of them were French Canadian, and they came across Lake Superior and worked their way through the Boundary Waters and went all the way out to the Western Mountains. And mostly there were two fur trade companies, and the Hudson Bay Company worked out of Hudson Bay, and there was the Northwest Territories, or the Northwest Company, who worked out of our region. So when it came time to divide the countries in two, the countries weren't really divided. And Canada wanted the border, or the US wanted the border to go all the way up to Thunder Bay. And the Canadians wanted the border to come down to the St. Louis River in Duluth, which means the entire Boundary Waters would have been in Canada. And the dividing line was the Voyager route, which started at Grand Portage because they had to walk 9 miles to get around all the rapids. And then they worked the actual fur trade route through the series of lakes. And you eventually ended up at Rainy Lake, and that went down to Lake of the Woods, and eventually went to Lake Winnipeg. The equivalent today would be all these 18-wheeler drivers who are hauling all the gear from the ports all across America. And the Voyagers did that, and they didn't have many luxuries, and their life was pretty tough. And they had two basically things they were concerned about. One was drowning, and the other would, from all the heavy loads, would be developing some kind of a hernia. Here's some scouts in a from Northern Tier in a fiberglass Voyager canoe out having some fun. So when you go to the Boundary Waters, you're going to see some pegs, and you can put 1 foot in Canada and 1 foot in the United States if you wish to. And these are located throughout. Now, when you're traveling to Boundary Waters, if you need to take a portage, that's the French Canadian pronunciation, or you call it portage. If you want to take one of those and it happens to be in Canada, you're allowed to walk the portage in Canada without any kind of a checking in or passport or whatever, but you can't camp in Canada unless you have a permit to be there, okay? The Lumberjacks were the next to come, and they cut down a lot of the forest, and they did it in the wintertime when there were no bugs and it was easy to work within in the snow. And then they would raft the logs up and float them out. And to keep the logs from getting away, they would drill in the rock and put this peg, and then they would have chains and they would hold the logs in place until they wanted to move them. And they couldn't run logs through some of the rapids, so they made logging sluiceways. And just look at the work. This was all done by hand. And then they would take these big PV poles and they would push the logs through. So today it's called a BWCAW because the W stands for wilderness. So the glaciers, which at one time were a mile thick, scraped all of Minnesota, but they scraped especially all of northern Minnesota. And what got exposed was the Precambrian granite shield, which is billions of years old. It's an easy place to walk on. It's an easy place to relax on. And it's just a piece of ancient history right there on the surface. So to be a legal campsite, and you can only camp at legal campsites, you must have a Forest Service grate. You don't have to cook on it if you're not using wood, obviously, but you have to have the grate there. And that's the identity. Most of these grates have rocks piled around from campers who are preventing the wind from causing too much havoc with your little fire. And the other thing you have to have, even though it's a wilderness, and these have saved the Boundary Waters, is one of these little fiberglass toilets. It'll be on a trail somewhere going off. You may have to check a couple of trails, and it'll be there. And it's only for human waste, okay? Only for your poop, nothing else. And because it's not real deep soil on campsites that are used a lot, this might get moved once or twice a year by a ranger. They'll come in and move them a few feet away. But those are the two things that make a campsite legal: fire grate and a toilet. Surprisingly, there's more land than there is water, but when you're on the water, you don't get to see where all the land is. But if you could fly over the Boundary Waters, it's just a huge, massive taiga forest. There are forest fires, and the ones that are set by nature, lightning strikes, don't usually cause a lot of havoc, but the ones that are set accidentally by humans do. So this is the whole north side of Gunflint Lake that got burned off a number of years ago. Burned some cabins down there on the Gunflint Trail, just disastrous. And the guy left the campsite and had not put his fire out completely. And if you are building a fire, you really have to drown it out. And if you can't put your hand on it, and if you can't stir it up, then you've got a problem. So this is a lightning strike. This is an island, and it's smoldering, and the island probably won't burn, and those trees probably won't burn. And it's just a few roots that got electrified. And it'll go out by itself. So every day when you get up, you have food, you're living in a shelter, and you put some clothing on. You do the same thing for the Boundary Waters. You'll probably use slightly different food. I hope you do. You don't want to bring everything in your house to the Boundary Waters because it's not going to work, and you don't have refrigeration. And you need a shelter. We call that a tent. And you need clothing. And you need clothing that on a bug season can prevent you from getting bitten up. And on the shoulder seasons, clothing that can keep you warm. And for food, you can use freeze-dried if you want, it works, but there's a ton of food in the grocery store, and all you do is repackage it. You get rid of all the packaging you don't want to haul up there, because you have to bring it all back if you do, and you can condense everything. But there's lots of dried food, lots of dried fruits, lots of oatmeals, lots of granolas, all kinds of things that you can make, okay? You can carry peanut butter in a plastic, and you can carry jam in a plastic. You can do all kinds of things for your food. So the two additions in the boundary water is you need transportation, and that's your canoe and your paddles. And then you have to find your way, and that's a navigational aid. And that's going to be a map and compass if you need one, and maybe a GPS if you need one. All I use are maps. Maps are my compass. And you have to have your permit. Certain times of the year, you can get some fresh food to augment your breakfast or your snacks. And there's lots of blueberries, and they're mostly July and August. You can also catch fish, and it's not that difficult. And you clean the fish and you can fry them up if you want. I'll have a picture coming up, or you can make them into a stew. So sometimes on the very first day, if we want something fresh and we've got a cooler in the car, we'll bring up some meat and some raw potatoes and some onions and maybe some carrots and whatever else. We learned this in Boy Scouts. Then you put this in foil and you wrap it up, and then you build a fire and you put it on the coals. And when it's done, you just open it up and there you are. And that was a big thing in Scouts. I don't want to waste that much time anymore. Often I'll bring salad ingredients for the first day, maybe even for the first 2 days. And spinach carries well for a day or two. And some of the salad ingredients, peppers last a long time. Onions last a long time. We threw some nuts in, they last forever. So that's just something different also. And we can bake. And these are Dutch ovens that are made out of aluminum. You can bake cakes, you can bake pies, you can bake bread, whatever you can bake at home, you can bake in one of these. You just have to become somewhat imaginative of what you want to do. So here's a nice fish, this little northern that's swimming by the campsite. And here's a bigger fish. We caught this guy kind of by accident on Otter Track Lake. And it's a big trout, and unfortunately it died. I didn't want it to die, but it did die. And it was more fish than we can eat. So we paddled around to a couple of campsites and we gave fillets away for people who either hadn't caught any or hadn't brought a fishing rod. And it was really good food. And here's a young guy on his first trip. So the guy in 59 who was wearing the cowboy hat eventually moved down in the California, Arizona area. And his son, when he was a teenager, came up for a canoe trip, and he had never caught a fish and never filleted it. And so he was learning how, doing a pretty good job. So fish is easy to fry, and there's lots of different ways you can fry it. And some people fry it with cornmeal, or some people fry it with a fish mix, and we carry some oil in a plastic bottle. But we do a better bottle than the ones that comes in the store. They're kind of fragile. They can get broken. And it's easy to do. And the other thing you can do is you can make a chowder. You can start with a packaged soup base and throw in some vegetables, either dried or freeze dried. And obviously throw some water in there, and then you fillet your fish and you cut them up in cubes, and then you boil everything up till it's cooked. And you can take dried potatoes or you can take whole potatoes and throw them in. And the fish doesn't take long to cook, so you put that in last. And the Finlanders call this moika, and it's our favorite food in the Arctic. We sometimes have it once or twice a week. It's delicious. The big thing is to keep your utensils clean, and you have two options. You can wash them in soap and water, but not in the lake. You have to wash it away from the lake. And we don't dry it with a greasy, grummy rag. We just let it air dry. And some other people just scrape everything out, and then they do the dip. What the Army does is you take bleach and water and put it in a pot, and you dip everything, and that supposedly kills any bacteria that are going to be there. So here's a modern day camp, and we carry food barrels. So you see we have two of the smaller ones in a pack, and they're waterproof, and they're, I think, pretty much bear proof, although a bear could probably break one open. But I don't hang packs. Hanging is recommended. I've seen a lot of bears crawl trees and knock packs down. I've seen people not put them high enough and the bear ripped the bottom off, but I've never had a real issue with bears. And we have cheese, and we have things that we don't want to get wet. And we've got granola, maybe some candy bars, and nothing goes in our tent. There's no food ever in our tent. And all the food gets locked up every night and covered up so we don't have odors. And that makes a big difference. And you can see we use bowls and a spoon, an insulated cup, and you can see there's some peanut butter there, and a plastic, which is legal. You can see our toilet paper, which is in plastic, which is legal. And then I have a utensil bag. You can see a scissors there. Scissors are the number one thing with all these packages we have that are, foil type things. Nice to cut them open. So you have tents and tarps are there for rain and they're there for sun protection, and the tents obviously to sleep in. And some of the tents for summer now are almost all mosquito netting, so they don't heat up. And then you have to have a rain fly over them. So here's a modern tent with a pretty good door. Still has some fabric on it. And I'll show you some in a little while that are just all mosquito netting. Typical outfitters tents, you see a lot of these, easy to put up. So here's a tent that's almost all mosquito netting. It's used for the summer. And I'm sitting in there, my handwriting is atrocious, and I have now graduated to solar power. And I have a waterproof case, which is sitting on my leg. And I have my iPad, which is up there. And I hate typing on my iPad, so I brought my keyboard. And sure, it weighs a few pounds, but I'm not traveling that hard and that fast. I'm sitting in my Crazy Creek chair. In the lower right, you can see kind of a machine. That's my CPAP machine. And it goes in that waterproof case, so it's always safe.
Hey, Bob.
Yeah.
Got a question, comment, or kind of a question that came in. Just I think it's referencing some of the slides you just showed. They're wondering about. I'll just read the comment. It says, offhand, do you have any comments on the past use of canoe rest structures on portages? What about stacked up rock cairns that mark trails and portages? Just any insight on that?
Well, there used to be canoe rests, and when it became a wilderness, they took them all out. There were canoe signs, and I'm going to show those in a little bit. And I hope people don't keep building these little nook shucks, because that's not really part of the wilderness. But some people think that that's what they have to do. So going back to tents, I tell people, and I didn't do this on this trip, tents get UV'd, tents get worn out. And believe it or not, I woke up on this one night and I'm sitting under an umbrella inside of my tent with my sleeping bag gathered around to keep it from getting wet. And in the morning, I took my ground cloth and put it on top because I had leaky seams and we had a big rain and it came right through. So older tents may leak and you want to make sure you check them out before you go. Outfitters won't send old gear out. Most of their gear is no older than 2 or 3 years. So we were on the water, a rainstorm came, we pulled a group in, I had some kids. We threw this up just the fastest thing we could do to get out of the downpour. Okay, this is not the way you set up a tarp. This is the way you set up a tarp. It makes more sense, but we want to get out of the rain. And we use these mostly for sunshade or a light rainy day, and you can sit under it and not have any problems. You don't want to be cooped up in your tent. Here's another option for bugs. You can get these bug tents, and they're somewhat lightweight, and they've got, again, a cover on them so you protect you from the sun, and then the bugs can't get in. Here's what a lean 3, and a lean 3 is made by Cook Custom Sewing. It's like a tent. It looks like an old baker tent. The fly could come down in the fall if you want to enclose it. It has mosquito netting. You can see some of it hanging down. And with a small cook stove that we use, you can actually cook under that fly. And I like these, and I'm using these now often instead of using a tarp. So we do take some electronics and we take them in the far north. I spend most of my time in July and August in the far north of Canada. So we have an inReach, and an inReach allows us to text out to people if we needed some help. In the Arctic, we can text our bush pilot, for example. They also have an SOS button. If you're really in dire need, you can push that. But that's like calling 911. You don't get the 911 response, but you will get a response, okay? And that's when you really have an issue that you need help as soon as possible. The texting, you could text to somebody that you agree ahead of time, someone in the family or your outfit or whatever, and you can say, hey, a bear mauled my tent. I don't have a tent, and we need some help, or the bear wrecked our canoe and we need some help. And that way it's not an emergency and they will get to you, but they will get to you a little slower. Now that inReach is waterproof, but guess what? It doesn't float. So the thing in the upper right is the life jacket for the inReach. And that inReach in the Arctic is always on my life jacket. So if I got knocked out and was away from my canoe and my gear, at least I have the inReach. The inReach is laborious to work with. You scroll down and find a letter and push on it, then you scroll and find another letter. And if you take your phone and Bluetooth it to the inReach, you can type on your phone's keypad, which is a lot easier. On the bottom left is a battery charging unit, and I can probably get 3 charges out of it before I have to charge it with my solar charger. But I do, at my age, I mean, I'm 80 years old, I do carry some protection. When I was a young kid, we never had any of this. And first of all, the electronics weren't there. And we just went and figured we'd find our way out sooner or later. So solar panels are nice. They're slow. You need sun. Some days you don't get sun. And that's why I carry 3 batteries for my CPAP. They're about the size of a paperback. They're lithium. It takes about 8 hours to charge them. And they'll go for a whole night. So I could go 3 full days and never have any sun and still be okay. Or I could go every other day and still be okay. So here's the rules of the roads. No cans, no bottles in the boundary waters, period. We used to have cans in the 40s, 50s, 60s until the Wilderness Act came. Now there's no cans, no bottles, okay? You pack out what you brought in, and that's everything. So if you're going to bring in extra packaging on your food, you have to bring that back out with you, okay? Never cut live trees, and don't cut dead and standing. They're part of the ecosystem and they're critical for habitat for other creatures. You want to take wood that's down on the ground and it has to be dry, obviously. And you reduce as much packaging as you can at home. So the whole idea is leave no trace, period. And in the Arctic, we have to burn our toilet paper because it takes forever to break down. But here you can put your toilet paper, which hopefully you don't need a lot, in your toilet. So there are a lot of real shallow creeks, and there's a lot of guys who don't live in Minnesota, and I'll pick on them. They come from one of my favorite places called Chicago, and they love to come to the boundary waters. And they love to wrap their canoes around rocks rather than make the portage. And that happens. And very seldom do people drown, but that's when you would have to get on your inReach and let people know that you can no longer paddle out because you just wrecked your canoe in a real shallow river because you avoided a portage, okay? So what I tell people is no one ever drowns on a portage, nor do you lose your canoe on a portage. You wait out all storms. And this happens especially on Memorial Day weekend, 4th of July weekend, and Labor Day weekend, when people go up for it, they take a day or 2 vacation, they stretch it into a 4 or 5 day trip, they go further than they should, they have to get back on Sunday, they need to be to work or school or whatever, and they run into a stormy day and they cross a big lake, and guess what happens? They swamp and they tip over and they maybe drown, but certainly they might get away from their canoe and are now in trouble. Life jackets work. We wear them all the time in the Arctic. We wear them in the boundary waters, and you have to have a life jacket in the canoe to start with, and it's best to wear them. And rapids are really not runnable in the boundary waters, and there's very few. So nature bats last. Nature runs everything. When we live in a house, we forget about nature. On a hot day, you turn on air conditioning. On a cold day, you turn on the heat. On a rainy day, you just get shelter. But out in the environment, it's your clothing and your tent and your tarp and your canoe that has to take care of all that. And when you see a storm like this coming, you get off the water, period. On the other hand, you can get drizzle days that are overcast and they're fine to paddle. In fact, you can stay warmer paddling than you can shivering under a tarp. However, when you go to portage after rain, every tree on that portage has got all these droplets of rain. And sometimes you have to wear your rain jacket if you want to stay dry, or you're going to get wet. The hardest thing for a lot of people is to get up in the morning, and that's fine. But if you want really easy traveling, the early morning hours, because we have long daylight in June and July, early morning hours, that 6, 7, 8 o'clock window is magic. A lot of people don't get on the water till 11. That's fine too. But if you really want to travel and don't want wind, you get on the water early. So here's your navigation. There's a number of kinds of maps. This happens to be a fisher map. The red dots are campsites. Normally they're still there. And the dotted lines are portages. And it says how many rods it's going to be. And they kind of indicate where they are, but a little, sometimes you have to hunt and peck a little to find them. And there used to be signs at the waterfalls. They're gone. So you now have to be able to figure out that this Basswood Falls is coming up by looking at your map. Also listening, sometimes you can hear the roaring water unless the wind's in the wrong direction. And if you're blind, you wouldn't be able to see the waterfall. You have to have somebody who can see, who could tell you it's dangerous and you're going to have to portage. So here's looking up a rapids, and this rapids is runnable, but you have to know what you're doing. And if not, you portage, because you can see this rock and only a piece of that rock is sticking up. But by the time you get to it, if you weren't reading the water, which is running away from the rock on the upper left, and you would steer away from it, you would end up being impaled on that rock. And then if you tip it upstream, you're going to really be in trouble. So if you have any doubts about whitewater, you take the portage. I love to walk. I love to get out and stretch my legs. I like to take my time. I'm not in a rush. I don't overload, especially at my age. I don't carry up when I was 18, I would take 2 packs in a canoe. I don't do that anymore. I walk back to see the sights. If you're going around a waterfall, you want to go back and see it. You can't see it with the canoe on your head, okay? And a portage is part of the trip. And you plan your route by how many portages you have to make, because they all take time. And when you have a lot of lake, you can do faster paddling. When you have a lot of portages, you don't cover as much ground. 90 rods is once around a running track. You can run it in under 60 seconds. You may have to walk it a rod, 90 rods, in maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes based on how rough the portage is, okay? These are the signs that used to be here before the Boundary Waters was a wilderness. So this portage was only 44 rods. It's only a couple hundred meters. Some guy felt it was longer. He's crashed to 144 rods. And some guy came by and said, no, this is just terrible portage. He thought it was 2,144 rods. So here's your portage. That's about what they look like. Because they're so well used nowadays, they're easy to find. And notice all the roots, and notice it's not the easiest place. So you're going to unload and then haul everything up to the portage trail before you start portaging. And you don't want to leave your canoe half full. You want to get everything out because other people may be coming the other way. So you don't want to clog the portage. And this is what a portage looks like. It's just a trail. It's not very much man-made. It's man-trampled. And there's rocks and roots and whatever. And if they've had a bad windstorm, you might have to drag over a deadfall. And this portage was built in Quetico. It's called Du Riviere. And this was the route from coming across Toronto and the Great Lakes. And they made their way into the Boundary Water, actually the Canadian side of the Boundary Waters. And pianos were hauled across here and furniture and everything. This was the way to Winnipeg before they had roads. It's a very historic spot. And the Forest Service in Canada put that in to make it easier to cross this little creek. Here's a portage in which it's gone. It got completely dismantled with the windstorms. And then things got kind of grew up and we had to bushwhack ourselves. We made it. And obviously, and as we were coming out, there's a ranger coming in. And we said, man, there's 2 portages that are gone. He said, yeah, we haven't been here in 3 years. And he had a whole bunch of tools to start reopening it up. This is fall and we have low water levels and we have to walk to the portage because you can see where the reeds are growing, there's hardly any water there. And so it's not even knee deep. And we couldn't paddle it. So we just walked in. This is teaching some kids at scout camp how to flip a canoe, and they're wet footing it. And that's the best way to do this, if it's possible, is in the water, or bring your canoe and walk in the water if it's shallow enough and set it down. You don't want to put it on land if you don't have to. Here's a guy. This is obviously not a bug season. Lightweight Kevlar, probably in the 30-pound age, older gentleman, taking just one trip at a time, wearing shorts and walking the portage. The best side of any portage, of course, is the end. No matter how short it is or how long it is, when you see that lake, you have that sigh of relief. But notice the landing, a lot of rocks. So you would put your canoe maybe up where the grass area is, get all your packs together. And then when you're ready, you'd move everything down to the water and you'd wet foot everything in to your canoe. And so here's a wet foot environment. In the summertime, people are wearing tennis shoes or water shoes. If it's colder weather, some people are wearing rubber boots, but we're not putting our canoe on the ground, loading with packs and dragging it in. And I've seen people do that. I've seen people try to hump their canoe in from the shoreline. That's terrible. So here's a portage that we didn't make. Going up, you can walk up this thing, and coming down, the kids just stood on each side, slid the canoe over that little edge. I had a rope on the back end just to make sure it didn't get away. I'm untying it, and we're gonna get back in and keep going. This is where Otter Track Lake comes into Knife Lake. So why do we go? Everybody has a different reason, and sometimes you go for all those reasons. A lot of people go to fish, and obviously you're camping. A lot of people love to camp. I love to camp. And it's quiet time and it's relaxing time. And for some of us in a really busy city environment, the quiet time is really precious. You can also explore, and there's adventure. It's like seeing something new around the corner. It's really fun to do. You experience a true natural environment. It's free of roads. It's free of telephone poles. It's free of houses. It's just a natural environment, and it changes with nature. And for a lot of people, they're looking for a challenge. And some people, the challenge is how fast can go, how far can go. And that's good too. And when you're young, those challenges are fantastic. When you get old, the challenge is to be able to go. So here's a nice sand spit. You pull in, you can have lunch. You could have camping here. Don't camp on the sand, although you'll have sand in your sleeping bag for as long as you want it. And you can go swimming if you want, okay? So here's the end of our portage, and you can hardly see the water because there's only a little bit. And we're going to get in, and we're going to push through this kind of reedy area, and then we're going to go out to the lake. I love streams, and a lot of streams are paddleable, and they have beaver dams to pull over. And you sometimes see wildlife. You don't always see a moose, but there are places you can. I can guarantee you this: if you sing a lot of songs as loud as you can, you'll never see any wildlife. Can see a deer. Deer didn't see us. And you can find some sheds, sometimes in the woods or in portages, because they shed every year. And there's lots of beavers. And surprisingly, beavers live on land. And they live on land in their wooden igloo, which is the house that they build. And they have a tunnel to go underneath, and they get up and they get on the land. And beavers need the deep water to protect themselves. And so they build a dam, and they'll build a series of dams, and they'll go up and down and get all the food they want and take it back to their lodge. And they'll take some of that inside in the winter. Pitcher plants, these grow in bogs, and they're a pitcher meaning like a water pitcher. And they have that big opening, and water goes in, insects drown. As they decompose, they get the nutrients. Wonderful plants. Water lilies, there's two varieties, the white one and the yellow one. Fun places, you see lots of those. Reptiles and amphibians are a little scarce because of the cold environment in the winter, in the long winter, but there are snapping turtles and there are painted turtles that you'll see there. They come out to sun, you'll see them on logs. This one is coming up in June to lay its eggs. Last year in the Boundary Waters, I had at least a dozen turtles in this big campsite I was on, all coming up to lay eggs at night. And they wait till pretty late at night, and you'll hear them scrounging around, laying eggs. There are some amphibians like like frogs and toads, but we've had acid rain now for probably 50 years in Minnesota. Mostly comes in from the south, from some of the big industrial areas, a couple states south of us. And the acid rain will affect the embryos of these animals. Here's a toad. So we have lots of loons. They make great calls. They have different calls. They're a beautiful bird. They dive really deep to get their food. They eat fish. They hardly ever come on land unless they're laying eggs on land and have a nest on an island somewhere. They'll often try and nest in the water on some reeds if they can. There's a loon nest. So the loon has a red eye so it can see underwater, and that's a special adaptation it has. Loons, you'll see them floating with their neck kind of tipped down, and they're basically snoozing when they do that. So there's some herring gulls, and we call them seagulls, and they got a big yellow beak with a red spot on it. And they'll make nests. Sometimes they'll put them on the ground. Sometimes they'll put them like on this rock where the arrow is. And they're very protective of their young, and they have two orifices. They have their mouth, which they can regurgitate, and then they have their anus, which they can poop. And it both comes out white. But if you want to really get a good bird picture, you probably need to have a wide brimmed hat, never look up, and get your picture and get away, because you're going to get bombed by the mother. So here's the young chick with this downy feathers. They'll grow up fast, and pretty soon will be able to eat it for itself. So here's a hummingbird. You can hear them frequently, but they're hard to see unless they hover, and they're getting the nectar from this birch tree, and they don't drill those holes. Those were drilled by probably a sapsucker or a woodpecker, and they're going in to get some of the sap. Here's a bird's nest in a pond. So you'll see really big nests on the white pines, and they belong to one of two birds, and they both eat fish. And one is the osprey, and the other is the bald eagle. And the bald eagles are absolutely majestic, and they made a huge comeback. They at one time were endangered in America, our national symbol, but now they're all over the place, and they're fun to watch. And they're fun to watch them fish. A lot of the insects have exoskeletons, and as they molt, they'll get rid of it, and they'll grow a little bigger and make another one. You'll find those. And there's a lot of insects that are water skimmers, and they got enough surface tension that they can run on top of the water like it's ice. And then your best friend are dragonflies, and dragonflies hatch out of water, and they look almost worm-like, and then they have to get their wings inflated, and they have to let their wings dry. And then they love to eat mosquitoes. That's their primary food, is mosquitoes. So they're kind of a friendly person to have around. If you're sitting in a canoe and there's some bugs around, a dragonfly comes up, some of the bugs disappear. Here's a flower with some butterflies, which are probably resting, and they're almost the same color, so it means that they're camouflaged from the bird that wants to eat them. And of course, our state flower in Minnesota is the lady slipper, called the moccasin flower. And it's an orchid, and orchids are pretty much May and early June, and usually by late June are drying up. Here's another orchid, nice little orchid to see. This is a flower that's very, very common, and it's white, and it's very, on a lot of portages you'll find these, and they have a red berry in the fall, and that's called Canada dogwood. And its Latin name is Cornus canadensis, but you don't eat the berries. And this is the fleur-de-lis. This was the symbol of the Voyagers, an iris, and they brought some yellow ones into the boundary waters and in the Quetico. And once in a while, you can find one of those rare fleur-de-lis that the Voyagers brought in. Here's a young pine regrowing. And the trees that get blown over will get recycled from the decomposers. So you have all the mushrooms and toadstools and other fungi, and that's how everything gets recycled. And if you dropped a hockey stick in the far north, it might take 1,000 years. And if you dropped a hockey stick down in the tropical rainforest, it might be gone in a couple of months. It all depends on how much moisture. So these straw-like things are actually pine needles, and the little teeny red spots you see are fungi, and these are called British soldier. That's their name. and they're decomposers, and they help break things down and recycle, create new soil. These are lichens, and they're an algae and a fungus living in a symbiotic union. They live together, they're attached together, and some are bright colored and some are dull as can be. And this is reindeer moss or caribou moss. It's different from trees or twigs because there's no bark and there's no tannic or tannic acid. And if you could eat an animal that fed only on this, it's like having grass-fed beef. Here's a big white pine. And here's a pine that got pushed over with a big windstorm. And because there's so much Precambrian shield and so little soil, it's not like being in southern Minnesota where it's really deep. The roots go out, and after a while, they don't have enough strength. When the tree gets really tall, it just topples it and the roots get snapped off. And you can see there's rocks in that root thing that when it got tipped over. So this kind of dead wood, you could paddle up and you could take a saw, your axe, and collect it for firewood. So here's a standing dead tree. It's decomposing. Insects have been working there. Ants have been living there. Different birds will build a nest in some of these cavities, and we don't want to cut these down. And the birches will naturally shed some of their outer bark, the paper birches, and they have a lot of resin. It's a great fire starter. So here's some recent trips. We got a bunch of old guys that get together in the fall when there's no bugs and people are done with their summer work, and we take trips in the Boundary Waters and the Quetico, or we go further north. We usually have 3 canoes worth. 3 canoes is the limit in the Boundary Waters and Quetico. 3 canoes. You could have up to 9 people, but 3 canoes is the limit. So here's a short portage. It's so short, this guy kind of overburdened himself. Notice this fall, and he's wearing his rubber boots. He doesn't want to wet foot it with tennis shoes. So here's a third seat, which is nice. They're not sitting on the bottom. You can sit up. And the guy in the middle and the guy in the bow are identical twins, and they are a hoot to be with because they have lots of fun with each other and they're just very enjoyable. They're both Scout executives. And here we are having lunch, nice Precambrian shield, dry, not a windy day. You can see we got some crackers out, we got some cheese out. And notice my plastic bowls, and I have a lot of different colors. And what I do is I assign everybody a color, and that's their bowl for the whole trip. And if their bowl doesn't get put back in the cook kit, in the tub you see there where the cups are in, then your next bowl is you just put your hands together and we pour your soup in it. I've never lost a bowl yet. It's amazing how that works. So here's fall trips. Now here's this, you can paddle through all year, but in the fall in low water, we end up walking through. And there is no portage here because it's usually paddleable. So here we are at the end of a portage. We're doing 1 canoe at a time. You can see the packs are being dropped off. A couple of guys are helping the other guys there, going to wet foot it, and then out we go. Every campsite will have a red squirrel, and they're fun to be around. And that's why we like barrels, because they can't get into them. But they're fun, and they love to chew pine cones. So all the guys in this photo are probably over 65. So here's a boat on the left that's great for the Boundary Waters. It's long, it's narrow, it goes really straight. So you don't have to be an accomplished paddler to make it go straight. On a river, however, it doesn't turn very well. The canoe on top is a little more challenging to paddle on a lake because it can get pushed around by wind because it has what we call rocker. And it's also a little wider, and it can probably carry a lot more weight. It'd be long for a longer expedition, especially 3 to 4 to 5 weeks. And there's lots of these big cliffs in the Boundary Waters. The Precambrian rock is exposed, and those trees are just getting their roots in the little cracks, and they can't grow really, really tall because they don't have enough nourishment. Here's a kid who decided to bypass a portage around a little swamp area, and he actually made it through. I was surprised. That was his challenge. Here's a young guy, little fishing after dinner, and we have good daylight, and fishing near fast water is excellent. Small little spinners, and you can catch some small walleyes and some smallmouth bass. So here's a young guy's first fish. It's always important. This is a special place. There's a few of them in the Boundary Waters. We have a waterfall tumbling down. Doesn't have to be a very big one. And you have a pool where you can sit in before it tumbles on or runs on. It's kind of a natural shower. Here's some kids going out to explore. Now they have to have their life jacket in the boat, but it's a warm day, no wind, not out very far in the lake. They're safe. Here's a kid not only on his first trip, but we're up where we found these sluiceways, which was kind of cool. And you can see it's the way of getting over a rapids area or ledge area. And the loggers would have been standing there and sliding them through one at a time. Fire's magic. Fire's always been magic. People around the world use fire all the time. Some people are still cooking on fire, and fires are fun. And we don't make big fires like this anymore. We tend to make smaller fires. And the other interesting thing is they get a dark night and the Milky Way and the stars are absolutely unbelievable. And I've had more than one kid from Minneapolis that we went up to the Boundary Waters and we're laying out on the Precambrian rock at night and we're looking at the Milky Way. And the question is, how come these don't shine in Minneapolis? And the answer is they do. We can't see them. Too much light pollution. So my claim to fame is I paddle at Thanksgiving, and we did it one year when we had a very late fall and nothing was freezing up. And I called a friend in the Ely. I said, what's it like? He said, the lakes are just beginning to freeze and the rivers are open. So I got a bunch of kids from my school and we went up Wednesday night of Thanksgiving vacation to Ely, and we got on the Kawishway River and we paddled Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and came out Sunday. And it was an interesting experiment. And you can see there's snow. It's different kind of camping. There are no bugs, but we got different kind of clothing and different kind of footwear. And coming out, they still had signs in those days. Coming out, as little edges were freezing up, we had to carefully walk along the edge and then pull our canoe with a rope to get it to the portage so we could get out. But notice how they're dressed. It is November in Minnesota. So the paddle season ends, unless you want to go further south. You go down into the southern states that don't have the snow we have. They have paddling all winter, but I don't get the chance to do that. And in the Boundary Waters, some of these streams will have water on the surface year round, and that makes them kind of dangerous. So if you're a snowshoer or a cross-country skier, or you're doing a dog team trip and you want to go in the Boundary Waters, at the normal river spots and some of the portages, that water will be open or the ice will be very, very, very thin. So you have to be very careful. So believe it or not, we had muskox, and they're only up in the Arctic now, but they were in Minnesota at one time. And that's because our environment has changed. It's been a changing environment. So we've changed our wildlife. We've changed our temperature. We've changed the pH of our land and water. We now have human influence on the Boundary Waters for hundreds of years. And it is a natural progression that just keeps occurring. Nature is not static. We at one time had caribou or reindeer here. It wasn't that long ago that there were some in the Boundary Waters. So here's the evolution, and this is called succession. This was a pond. You can see where the shoreline was in the background, the tall trees. And as the pond gets covered with aquatic vegetation and it dies and falls down and new vegetation grows up, you fill in at about 1 foot of sediment every 1,000 years. And so if this pond was like 6 feet deep, it's taken 6,000 years to fill this in. Notice there's nothing in the middle for trees, and that's because the pH is different. But you can see trees making a ring around there. They'll eventually expand out. The whole thing will look like the background in another few thousand years. You can find this not in the Boundary Waters, but all over Minnesota. Certain bays, shallows are going through succession. It won't change until the next glacier scoops them all out again. And some species are not going to survive climate change as the temperature goes up. They're going to be going further north, but they're going to die out in the Boundary Waters because they can't handle the change in temperature, okay? And the moose is in trouble. We have half the number because we're getting longer summers, and they don't know why, but it may have to do with some of the insects, or it may have to do with some disease, but they're definitely about half the number of moose we have now than we had back in the 50s and 60s. So you can plan your trip. Planning for some people is 90% of the trip because it goes on for many months. You get involved, you have a lot of fun, you look at options, you lay everything out in your basement, you try everything on, you set your tent up, and then you finally get to go out and take your 3 to 5 to 7 day trip. So thanks for participating if you were here. And a reminder, nature bats last, and you don't run rapids that have portages around them. Otherwise, you are in trouble. So that's it. So I don't know if we have any questions or not, Adam.
Let's see here. I don't see any in the chat here, but I just wanted to kind of ask. We have a lot of hopefully renewed interest in the boundary waters. Obviously, there's a lot of there's a big fight happening to protect the waters.
Right.
With regard to the mines and stuff being proposed. I'm wondering about sort of first time visitors, and I know you covered some of this on in your presentation, but what sort of things might some first time visitors want to keep in mind that just off the top of your head are kind of at least important to you or that you've seen that people have kind of
Good. Well, the first thing is the worst thing you can do is arrive in the boundary waters about 3 or 4 in the afternoon and try to go someplace because you're not going to get very far.
That's so true.
and campsites today with more people are filling up in the 3, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock window. They used to never fill up. And so that's one thing. And so what I can do, because I live in Minneapolis, and it's a 4-hour drive, I can leave here at 4:35 in the morning and I'm in Ely by 9 o'clock and I get my permit and I drive out and I'm on the water by 11 o'clock, but maybe I'll make camp at 1 because I've been driving all day and I'm just up there and that's fine. And the other thing is that people who've never been there sometimes plan too much of an ambitious trip. And I think you go cautiously and you go slowly. And if you're not a camper, you've got to learn some camping skills. And it takes a lot of time to set up a camp and take it down if you're not experienced. And that's the problem of people getting on the water at 11 and then trying to get off at 4 or 5. So you're barely on the water and then spending another hour setting up their camp or more. So that's one thing. The other is if you own your own equipment and maybe it's brand new, you bought a brand new tent, set it up in your backyard if you got one, sleep on it, put the cover on, put your hose on it, make sure everything is works. The other thing is you don't need a lot of clothes. I mean, you don't have an outfit for every day. You don't have one for morning and one for the afternoon. You wear a set of clothes. You maybe bring a little extra. Today I'm using a lot of merino wool. I don't take much cotton. Even in the summer, I don't take much cotton. They say cotton kills, and that's especially true in the shoulder seasons. If you get wet and damp in cotton, you're in trouble. People forget about their ears. And when you're out on the water and you're getting blasted with sun, you maybe want some kind of a hat other than a baseball hat that protects your ears. And you can certainly use, there's a lot of clothing made now that's lightweight clothing, but it is got sun protection built into it. It's got a rating of 50 or better. So you need to cover up those arms. There's nothing worse than getting sunburned and sitting in a tent in a sleeping bag. It's just terrible. You don't want that to happen.
Chips. We got a question that came in here. The question is, do you forage any plants for consumption in the boundary waters, or is that an option? Maybe not you specifically, but
if you know your plants, there are some people who really are into botany and really know their plants. You can forage, it's legal. There's nothing against that. You're not supposed to collect stuff and take it out. But if you know your mushrooms, fine. If you don't know your mushrooms and you get sick, you've got a problem. If you can get blueberries, fine. If you like to eat fern fronds, that's probably fine. Nothing against that.
Yeah, just definitely know your stuff and
right.
Use extra precaution. Kind of going back to the gear thing. One thing that personally has helped me kind of be a bit more ahead of any impending weather was to I got one of them great cook custom tarps and I pre-rigged it all. Had my corners with
Right.
25 feet of
Yep.
line, got everything ready so that when it came time to set it up, it wasn't like, oh yeah, let's tie this section of rope to the corner and then it's already there and ready to go. So doing little things like that, like you said, set up your tent, set up your sleep system, make sure you know how your stuff works.
Well, it's the same
Um,
way. So your sleeping bag, you don't need right away, and your
mhm,
tent maybe near, you need to have it if you're gonna set up in a hurry.
yeah,
Tarp needs
yeah,
to be accessible if you're gonna have bad weather. And definitely, when I pack, my rain gear is on the very top of the pack. In fact, I can just stick my hand on the flap and pull it out.
yeah,
Because the last thing you want to do, and then when you're out in the canoe, it's raining, you can't take your pack apart. So you have to be able to slide something like that out or stuff it back in again.
yeah. Are you a like air-filled pad person or a closed cell foam pad sleeping pad?
So when I started, I had nothing. Then I started sleeping in moss. Then I
Yeah.
got a life jacket in 67. We went to Hudson Bay. There was three parts and fell out, and it covered my hip to my shoulders. That was my first foam pad. Then I went up to the closed cell pad system. I've got the blow up system. Um, Sometimes I still like sleeping on the ground, so I've done
Yeah,
a little of each. Part of it depends on how much space you have. Some of these pads take up a lot of space, and
that's true.
but you need something. You definitely need some protection of some kind, and to get
Yeah.
off. Um, I do take a small pillow. My pillow used to be rolled up clothing, and you know what happens to that over the night. So I finally
Oh yeah.
converted to one of the little blow up pillows. That's really a luxury as an old man. That's kind of
Yeah.
fun to have. Yeah.
Classic. We get a lot of people here at the shop, obviously gearing up for all kinds of adventures. I've been finding myself sharing with a lot of customers, especially when they're buying these air-filled pads. They're great because they can fill up half inch all the way up to probably like 4 or 5 inches thick,
Right.
super comfortable, and some of them have kind of like a pillow top. But one thing I remind them to do is, I said, fill up your sleeping pad last, because if you
Yep.
fill up a sleeping pad and leave it in a hot tent during the day,
Yeah.
that thing's just going to expand, and you won't that it'll create little micro holes along the seam,
Yeah.
and
Right.
and
Yeah.
then you'll wake up in the middle of the night with a pad that isn't holding its air. So, and people are sometimes kind of just like, oh yeah, I guess I never thought of that. Like you're not going to be, unless you're actually actively using it in your tent during the day. Just blow it up when you're ready to use it,
Right.
or later in the day.
When the
Little things
first
like that will save your gear and make it last so much longer.
when the first inflatable anything came out, that was one of the things that bothered me, that they do get leaks, they do get holes. We've had it. Of course, you carry a small roll of duct tape because
Hmm.
that solves all problems
Yeah, that's
of
true.
everything.
Yeah.
And but that's one of the advantage of blow up is they're really small to take. The disadvantage is if you don't treat them well and they get some holes or breaks. So it's a 50-50 choice. I think everybody probably owns a closed cell and they also own a blow up, and they just probably go back and forth.
Yeah, yeah. I think I tend to grab. I guess my choice depends on the kind of trip I'm doing. If I'm by myself, I might go my close cell phone because I'm going to be carrying everything
Right.
essentially. I've actually never done a solo trip in the Boundary Waters. That's definitely on my bucket list of things to do here in the next couple of years. A lot of
Well,
multi-group trips, etc. But
there's two ways you can do the Rod Johnson ultra, ultra, ultra light and hope you don't have any problems, or you can do the
yeah,
Era, take 2 or 3 trips on a portage and you have everything you ever need, and it's still not overweight, but
yeah,
it's comfortable. you
yeah.
know.
That's a good point.
I
Excellent.
just bought my first chair ever. I've always used a Crazy Creek, which also can serve as a foam pad.
Hmm.
And even if I have a blow up, I stick it underneath anyway at night.
Yeah.
And I bought my first chair. It's 3 pounds. That's a lot more weight than I probably carried, but maybe it's time to get off the ground and relax a little more. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think there's the Boundary Waters is such a wonderful place to visit, obviously because of its natural beauty, but it's the kind of trip where you can really kind of dictate how intensive of a trip you want it to be through the portages you choose to go to, through if
Right,
you choose to do them at all. Obviously,
right.
some lakes, there's some massive lakes with, you get some big winds. You might be shorebound. You might see some whitecaps out there. But you can bring some of those luxury items like a 3 pound chair, or
Yep.
that thicker sleeping pad, or really trim it down so you can kind of kind of go full glamping or real minimal. The thing to keep in mind, I think, at the end of the day is just practice those leave no trace principles and hopefully leave it better than you found it. So
Cool.
all right. Let's see. I don't have any more questions, but I just want to remind people that all these presentations are being recorded and they'll be on our YouTube page. You can find this presentation and any of the others at youtube.com/Midwest Mountaineering. I think we have one more presentation today on through hiking the spear hiking trail, and then a few more for tomorrow to kind of round out the end of the Midwest Mountaineering Outdoor Adventure Expo. I just want to personally say thank you to Bob and everyone else who's presented. I really appreciate your guys' time and your info and willingness to share that. I hope that you people out there watching this found this to be enjoyable, and always looking for suggestions and ideas for any future presentations. So if anyone's got any ideas or is interested in presenting, they can get a hold of me at the shop here. My name is Adon. I'm usually here most days, so or just drop a question in the chat and I'll get back to you. So I think with that, I don't see any more questions. Maybe we'll sign off, Bob. What do you think?
Don, thank you. I can do that. I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to go have lunch.
All right, you enjoy it. Take care. Appreciate your time.